Welcome to the Lost Sci-Fi Story channel. If you're ready, let's begin today's story.
The shuttle broke through the cloud cover at precisely the wrong moment, which Eli Voss had come to accept as the defining theme of his career. Not wrong in any catastrophic sense. No alarm sounded. No warning light painted the cabin in the particular shade of red that meant something had gone structurally wrong with the only object standing between him and an alien atmosphere. But wrong in the intimate, quietly humiliating way that his life consistently arranged itself. He had just bitten into a nutrition bar that tasted like compressed chalk, and the memory of petroleum when the clouds parted, and the Imperial Palace of the Vaethari Dominion came into full view below. And it was the most magnificent thing he had ever seen in 41 years of living, 3 of which had been spent negotiating resource treaties on behalf of humanity. It felt cosmically inappropriate to witness genuine grandeur while chewing. The palace occupied the crown of a plateau wide enough to swallow a mid-sized Earth city whole, and it rose from that plateau in crystalline tiers that fractured Serendihal's twin suns into colors that had no names in any human language he spoke. He had reviewed the holographic models 17 times during the 6-week transit. The models had been inadequate in the precise way that all representations of overwhelming things are inadequate. Technically accurate, spiritually useless. He pressed his forehead against the viewport. Behind him, his diplomatic attaché Suyin Park, who had survived 11 interstellar negotiations through the twin virtues of meticulous preparation and a constitutional inability to be moved by anything, continued reviewing her tablet without looking up. "The approach vector takes us through the secondary receiving bay," she said, "not the ceremonial entrance." "What does the ceremonial entrance look like?" She consulted her screen. "Like this but with flags." "Is that good or catastrophic?" "I'm genuinely asking." "Secondary bay is traditional for substantive diplomatic arrivals. They're taking you seriously." "Wonderful," Eli said. "I find being taken seriously significantly more terrifying than being dismissed." This was not entirely a joke, though he delivered it as one. Jokes were what he used the way other people used antacids, not to resolve anything, but to create enough momentary relief to continue functioning. The reality beneath the joke was considerably heavier. 37 Earth colonies spread across 2 star systems were currently experiencing what the Colonial Resource Bureau's most optimistic analysts called a manageable supply tension, and what everyone actually living in those colonies called watching their children eat rationed protein and wondering if the lights would hold through winter. The Vaethari Dominion controlled the mineral extraction corridors running through Serendihal. 1 empress, 6 worlds, and a trade agreement that the Bureau had been failing to negotiate for 3 years stood between those colonies and something that would stop being a tension and start being a catastrophe. The shuttle banked, and the palace filled every viewport simultaneously. Up close, the crystalline tiers revealed what distance had hidden. Each surface was carved in flowing Vaethari script, vertical columns running the full height of the structure. His translation module rendered one passage in a tone of mild bewilderment, as though the AI itself found the content unexpectedly weighted. "The burden of those who wait is the only law the powerful are required to learn." He read it twice. He finished the nutrition bar because whatever happened in the next several hours, low blood sugar would not be among his excuses. 5 minutes to docking, the pilot said. Suyin straightened her jacket. Eli straightened his. They looked at each other with the wordless acknowledgement of 2 people who had prepared as far as preparation reaches and were now standing at the edge of everything it couldn't. "One more thing," Suyin said. "If it's bad news, tell me after we land. The Empress conducts first audiences alone. No attachés permitted in the throne room." Eli looked at her for a long moment. "That," he said with great precision, "is bad news. You asked me to wait until we landed." The docking clamps engaged below them with a sound like the closing of something that would not reopen on request, and Serendihal's twin suns sat low and burning on the horizon, and Eli Voss finished straightening his jacket a second time, because the first time had apparently not taken. The receiving corridor smelled of something Eli could not name, and his translation module could not categorize, which placed it in the same filing cabinet as several other Vaethari phenomena he had encountered in the past 11 minutes. Real, present, and entirely outside the jurisdiction of his briefings. It was almost mineral rain on hot stone, but with an undertone his brain kept trying to process as music despite it producing no sound whatsoever. He walked through it the way you walk through unexpected weather, accepting it as a condition of the environment rather than a puzzle requiring immediate solution. He had enough puzzles. He was, professionally speaking, a man standing inside the largest one he had ever entered. The attendants who had collected him from the secondary bay moved with the synchronized quiet of people who had been doing this for so long that individual thought had long since been replaced by collective precision. Two ahead, one to each side, none of them speaking or looking at him directly. He had been told, in a single footnote of a briefing document that had otherwise prioritized trade tariff structures, that direct eye contact from a Vaethari attendant indicated either personal interest or impending security escalation, and that distinguishing between the two required contextual reading he had not yet developed. He was therefore grateful for the footnote and grateful for the absence of eye contact, and doing his best not to think about which category he would fall into. He spent the walk doing what he always did before negotiations that could go wrong in several hundred distinct ways. Cataloging small things. The floor tiles ranged from deep amber to pale gold, and their variation was patterned rather than random, but the pattern was too large to read from a single vantage point, the way certain ancient earth mosaics only resolved into meaning when viewed from elevation. He made a note to himself, the way he always made notes to himself in rooms that were smarter than they appeared, which in his experience was most rooms. The corridor ceiling was vaulted, and the vaults were acoustic rather than structural. He could hear his own breathing return to him in a faint half-second delay, a reminder that sound here was not private. Someone had designed this building so that every person who moved through it understood, at the level of the body before the level of the mind, that they were being observed, not surveilled, received. There was a difference, and the difference was the entire point. The doors at the corridor's end were the size of a significant political problem, which felt appropriate. They opened without visible mechanism. On the other side was the throne room, and it was, in the specific way that certain things exceed their own reputation, larger than anticipated. He had anticipated very large. Guards stood at intervals along every wall in ceremonial armor that was not. His instincts noted with the brisk efficiency of a man who had been in enough tense rooms to develop instincts worth noting, purely ceremonial. The weapons were functional. The postures belonged to people who trained. The room was power rendered spatial, and he was standing in its precise center, which was either a position of honor or a targeting geometry, and he had a strong professional suspicion it was designed to feel like both simultaneously. Then he saw the empress, and his professional composure, which had served him across 11 years and 2 star systems, continued to function, but at a sincerely reduced efficiency. Vaethari was standing beside the throne rather than seated on it, and at 30 meters she appeared, in outline, like a human woman of remarkable stillness. At 20 meters the details began to surface. At 10, when the attendants stopped and Bode and Eli stopped with them, he understood why the holographic briefing images had been, without exception, slightly out of focus. Her skin held a luminescence that was not dramatic, not glowing, nothing that would register on a sensor calibrated for bioluminescence, but carried a quality like light on deep water, a suggestion of depth where a surface should resolve. Her hair was the precise color of space between stars, and it moved, very faintly, in the complete absence of any detectable air current. Her eyes, when they found his, had no iris and no pupil, only a shifting silver amber that changed depth as she focused, the way a lens accommodates to what it has decided to actually look at. She looked at him with those eyes for a moment that had no defined length. "Eli Voss," she said, and her voice carried two layers, her own language running beneath the translated words like water beneath something solid, present and in motion. "Empress," he said, and executed the bow that Su Yin had specified, and he had practiced 17 times on the shuttle, and he counted the seconds, and he straightened, and he thought with complete clarity. "I am not remotely prepared for this, which means this is exactly the situation I was built for." The two thoughts had coexisted in him for his entire career, and he had never once found a way to make them feel less contradictory. "You are afraid," she said, not a question, not a verdict, something in between, offered with the neutrality of someone reading data they did not find surprising. "Respectfully," he said, "yes, though I prefer to describe it as a very thorough understanding of consequences." Something moved in her expression, not quite a smile, but the tectonic condition that precedes one. "Be fearless," she said. He had the response prepared. He had practiced it. He opened his mouth, and the Empress turned to her security staff and spoke. He did not understand the words. His translation module, calibrated across 14 months for formal diplomatic and sacred registers, stumbled over what she said because it was delivered in a third mode entirely. A command register, short and load-bearing, the kind of language that didn't need volume because it had never needed volume, because for 800 years of documented imperial history, it had never once been ignored. He didn't need the translation. He understood the language underneath the language, the almost imperceptible shift that moved through the guards closest to the throne, a collective adjustment so small it would have been invisible to someone who hadn't spent a career reading rooms. He understood the stillness of the military advisor standing 3 meters to his left, who had until this moment been radiating the contained competence of a man who considered himself structurally necessary, and who was now radiating something considerably less comfortable. Then the guards began to leave, not dismissed, withdrawn. There was a distinction his body registered before his mind named it. Dismissal is casual. What he was watching was a military withdrawal conducted in the ceremonial register, disciplined and sequential, and the discipline was the point because discipline was the only thing preventing the discomfort from becoming visible, and the discomfort was enormous. He could feel it moving through the room the way pressure moves through a sealed space when something fundamental changes. They filed out through the exits, pairs and singles, and they took their functional weapons and their trained postures with them. And the room, which had been designed to hold hundreds, began to hollow itself out in a silence that was not empty but charged, the way the air charges before a storm that hasn't announced its intention yet. The military advisor was last. He paused at the threshold and looked back, and he did not look at the Empress. He looked at Eli. The look was the look of a man performing rapid arithmetic on a problem he had believed solved, and the new variable he was adding was human and standing in the center of the room in a slightly wrinkled diplomatic jacket, and the arithmetic was not resolving cleanly. Then the doors accepted him and closed behind him with a resonance Eli felt in his sternum, and the throne room contained 2 people, and the silence it contained was the loudest thing Eli had heard since leaving Earth. He stood very still. This was not a strategy. It was the natural response of a man whose mental model of the situation had just been comprehensively revised, and who required a moment to build a new one. He was, objectively, standing in the center of the most powerful room in 3-star systems, and the only other person in it had just removed every armed individual between herself and a foreign diplomat she had met approximately 4 minutes ago, and the thing he kept returning to, the thing his mind circled with the focused attention of someone who has identified the load-bearing element, was that she looked entirely unbothered by this. Vaethari was watching him with the silver-amber eyes, her hands loose at her sides, standing beside the throne she had not once sat in since he entered, and 20 meters of empty marble floor lay between them, and he was acutely aware that the marble floor was a great deal more empty than it had recently been. "You dismissed them," he said, because he was a negotiator and silence, however eloquent, was not his primary instrument. "I did," she said. "Your entire security detail. They were not necessary." He absorbed this. He looked at the doors. He looked at her. He said, with the specific tone of a man who has made a professional decision, that honesty is statistically less dangerous than the available alternatives. "I want to make sure I'm reading the gesture correctly, because gestures at this scale tend to carry meaning I can't afford to misinterpret. You've made yourself exactly as unprotected as I am." "Yes, that's intentional." "Everything I do," said Empress Vaethari, with a patience that was not condescension but something that had been refined across many years into something finer and more precise, "is intentional." He nodded. He was thinking about 37 colonies. He was thinking about rationed protein and winter power grids, and the 6-week transit during which he had rehearsed this negotiation in every configuration his imagination could generate. And not one of those configurations had included standing alone in an empty throne room with the most consequential political figure in the known reach of human explored space, who had just voluntarily removed every structural advantage her position afforded because, and this was the part the briefings had not covered, had not even gestured toward, she had apparently decided that whatever was going to happen between them required conditions that her security apparatus made impossible. He thought about what she had said 4 minutes ago, be fearless. He had interpreted it as diplomatic courtesy, standard magnanimity extended to nervous guests. He had a prepared response and everything. "That phrase," he said, "be fearless. You said it before you cleared the room." "Yes, I thought it was a formality." "I know," she said. "That's why I demonstrated it." Eli Voss stood in the geometric center of an empty room that had been built to make equality impossible, and looked at a woman who had just made equality possible through the simple and irreversible act of matching his vulnerability with her own, and felt something shift in the architecture of the conversation they hadn't started yet, a foundation being laid rather than assumed, which in his experience was either the beginning of the best negotiations or the kind of moment that got significantly misrepresented in the official reports afterward. "All right," he said. She looked at him. "Then let's talk," he said. She moved not toward the throne but toward him, stopping at a distance that was human rather than ceremonial, close enough that the conversation could not be anything other than what it was going to have to be. Honest, bilateral, and entirely without a safety net for either of them. Which was, he was beginning to understand, exactly the point. The conversation did not go the way the briefings had predicted, which Eli would later decide was the most optimistic thing that could be said about it. The briefings had anticipated a formal exchange, structured along traditional Vaethari diplomatic protocol. Opening declarations of intent, a ritual acknowledgement of shared historical relationship, which in this case amounted to 11 years of cautious long-range communication, 2 collapsed preliminary missions, and 1 incident involving a misread navigational beacon that the Bureau still classified, and that Eli had read the file on anyway, because he was constitutionally incapable of entering a room without knowing what had previously happened in it. Followed by a structured negotiation sequence in which both parties would stake opening positions at significant distance from their actual positions and spend several sessions choreographing the slow, careful closure of that distance. None of this happened because Vaethari sat on the steps of her own throne rather than on the throne itself, looked at him with those silver-amber eyes and said, "Tell me what you actually need." Eli, who had been preparing to deliver his opening statement, said, "I'm sorry. Not the position your government constructed for this conversation. Not the request designed to accommodate subsequent revision. What the people who sent you here actually need." He looked at her for a moment that he did not fill with words, which was unusual for him and felt, unexpectedly, like the correct response. Then he said, "The corridor." Not access, not favorable terms, the corridor itself. Guaranteed, long-term, unambiguous access to the mineral extraction routes through Serendi How. Everything else on my authorization list is a consequence of that. Without the corridor, the colonies don't have a logistics infrastructure that functions. With it, almost everything else becomes manageable. He paused. I'm aware that's probably not the most strategically cautious opening statement in diplomatic history. No, she agreed, but it is the most useful one I've heard in several years of receiving them. She was quiet for a moment, and he had already begun to understand her silences as a form of active thinking rather than withdrawal, the way certain very precise people use stillness the way others use motion. Her hair moved in that faint, fieldless way he had stopped finding strange and started finding characteristic, like a gesture belonging specifically to her. "The corridor is not mine to release cleanly," she said. "Not because I lack authority. I have the authority. But it is currently functioning as collateral in a resource dispute between 3 of my planetary governors, and freeing it as a diplomatic gift would generate an internal consequence that would consume considerably more of my attention than this negotiation." She looked at him with a directness that was not aggression but its own kind of honesty. "That is also not something I would have said in a formal session. We seem to be doing something other than a formal session." "We do," she said. "What can Earth offer that would make releasing the corridor politically viable on my end, concretely?" This was the question he had spent 6 weeks preparing for and simultaneously dreading, because the honest answer was layered, and the simplified answer was misleading, and the gap between them was exactly the kind of gap that had swallowed the previous 2 missions whole. He chose honest, because the room had been emptied for honesty, and using it for anything else felt like a waste of the gesture. 3 things, he said. Deep-core atmospheric modeling technology that would give your agricultural worlds a 20-year advantage in climate projection. A bioengineered grain variant engineered to survive your star system's specific radiation bands, which we developed over the past 4 years without informing you, which I'll acknowledge was not our finest diplomatic moment, and for which I'm personally sorry. He paused. And the third thing is harder to explain without sounding like my government lost its collective mind, which I'm not entirely certain it hasn't, so I'll simply say it. We are authorized to extend a standing invitation for the Empress of the Vaethari Dominion to visit Earth. Any location, no political agenda, no formal itinerary. Someone in the Bureau read your cultural intake files and discovered a documented interest in Earth's oceans, and they thought. Vaethari made a sound. It stopped him mid-sentence. He had not heard it before from any Vaethari, had no cultural framework for it, had 0 briefing material that covered this particular frequency. It took him approximately 2 seconds to identify it, because it was brief, and she recovered from it quickly, but the throne room's acoustics were unambiguous. She had laughed. "The oceans," she said. "The oceans," he confirmed. She looked at him with an expression he was still learning to read but was beginning to suspect contained something that had no diplomatic category. "Someone read my intake files. Someone in my government is either a very gifted diplomat or a profoundly strange human being. In my experience, those qualities tend to travel in pairs." She was quiet again, but it was a different quality of quiet than before, lighter, if that word applied to empresses, which he was increasingly willing to argue it did. "The grain variant," she said finally. "The atmospheric modeling, these are significant offers. They're genuine ones." "I know," she said. "That's why they're significant." She stood, not abruptly but with the measured movement of someone reaching a decision they have arrived at carefully rather than quickly, which in Eli's experience was the only kind of decision worth anything. "The corridor can be released. It will require 3 conversations with 3 governors that I do not particularly look forward to having. The grain and the modeling technology will give me the material leverage those conversations require. She looked at him steadily. And the invitation to your oceans is something I will consider in a context that has nothing to do with trade agreements. Eli Voss stood in the empty throne room of the Vaethari Dominion and felt something he had not felt walking into it. Not the relief of a negotiator whose authorization checklist was resolving favorably, but something quieter and more durable than relief. 37 colonies, rationed protein, winter power grids. The weight of those who wait, carved into the crystal face of a building he had pressed his forehead against from a shuttle window, was the only law the powerful were required to learn, and he had walked into the palace of the most powerful individual in 3-star systems and found someone who already knew it, had perhaps always known it, and had spent the last hour proving it in the only way that mattered. "Thank you," he said. She inclined her head,